We, uh, we have quite the panel. It's a stellar panel, and I'd like to start off by introducing them. We're going to start with, let's start from the end here. Ambassador Arturo Sarucan is an international strategic consultant and former Mexican ambassador to the U.S., as well as a National Immigration Forum board member. Next to him is Chief Art Acevedo, the chief of the Houston Police Department. And next to him is Paola Avila, the Vice President of International Business Affairs at the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. Edward Alden is the Bernard Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And immediately to my right is Sarah Goldfeather, the principal at Earncliffe Strategy Group. And I'll start with Chief Acevedo. You're not exactly on the border. How do border policies impact you? At a time when you have SB 4, you're trying to build community relations with immigrants, how does that make your job more difficult? Or does it?
Well, yeah. Can you hear me okay? Am I on? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. You know, we're not on the border, but we're close enough to the border. And when you're the most diverse city in the country, in Houston, Texas, and the capital of human trafficking, human smuggling, unfortunately, in Houston, Texas, border policy and what we do in terms of the rhetoric and everything else that relates to border policy and border security and immigration policy has an impact on the psyche of the people that we serve. It has an impact on our ability to actually utilize community policing strategies to keep Houston, the fourth largest, fastest growing big city in the country, safe. And so, not to mention the fact that when they pour billions of dollars into border security, where our Department of Public Safety has been the billions of dollars they've poured there to be on the border, when in fact the borders are pretty safe and border communities are fairly safe, and the violent crime is where? In the big cities. It's drawing resources, it's drawing police resources and funding resources and equipment resources away from where they need to be to keep Texans safe. So it's really being focused more on politics than on good policy, and that's why we're here weighing in on these issues. How does
SB 4 impact you?
SB 4 has been, SB 4, we call it political theater. You know, it really is political theater. It's not it was packaged and sold to the people of Texas as a public safety measure. It completely is counterintuitive and counterproductive as it relates to public safety. It's created the perception in immigrant communities that police officers, as of September 1, are more interested in their immigration status, than they are in bringing victims and witnesses to crime out of the shadows and forward. Because of not only because of the policy, but also the ugly narrative and the mean-spirited political debate, which is quite more mean-spirited and much more, I think, extreme than the actual policy. We've created a perception that these folks are not wanted, they're not valued, we don't care about them, all they are is property to be used until we no longer need them, and then we can deport them. And we've seen a chilling effect on people cooperating with the police in Houston. And here's the unintended consequence. A person that's afraid to come forward because they're undocumented, we know we have 11 to 15 million. And the intended consequence is when your grandchild or child is at the bus stop and they get kidnapped by that pedophile into a van, if the only person that is that nanny that witnessed it can give us, call 911, or the day laborer or the gardener or whomever, does not come forward, explain to me how we've enhanced public safety. It's going to impact all of us negatively.
Edward, for the longest time, for many years, the argument has been in Washington that you cannot do immigration reform, have immigration reform, unless you secure the border. How do you measure success? I mean, what metrics does the Department of Homeland Security use to measure border security, and how effective are these metrics?
I mean, apparently, and thank you, it's great to be here. I mean, apparently you can't do immigration reform even if you have secured the border. You know, if we look at the numbers, and I'll talk briefly about different ways of measuring it, I mean, there's no question that the border is far more secure than it has been in any of our lifetimes. I think the debate was a genuine one in the 1990s and the 2000s, when I think clearly the border was pretty porous. But if you look at what's happened over the last decade, depending on how you measure it, illegal entry at the border is down anywhere from 75 to 90%. The amount of successful illegal immigration occurring across the border is tiny. The Department of Homeland Security measures this in not very effective ways, counts the total number of apprehensions, which, as a lot of you probably understand, that can be a measure of declining numbers of people trying to enter illegally. It can also be a measure of ineffective effort by the Border Patrol. It's never been a particularly good measure. The Border Patrol has tried to improve it. I worked on a project. The outcome was very frustrating. Secretary Johnson commissioned some colleagues of mine to put together a very detailed set of estimates. For the first time, credible estimates of the actual number of illegal entries across the southern border using a variety of survey and modeling techniques. I was very hopeful that was going to come before the public before the end of the Obama administration. They decided for a variety of reasons not to release it. I think the problem with this is that the public doesn't understand what's going on at the border. You ask the public, is illegal immigration rising or falling? And strong majorities in both political parties believe illegal immigration to the United States is rising. It's because I think, media may be part of it. You could probably talk to this better than I could. Media coverage may be part of it. I think it's partly because administrations have never developed good measures that they're putting forward consistently to the public to explain the progress that's being made. And of course, just quickly, the other dimension that's so important here is the nature of the challenge at the border has changed so fundamentally. In the 90s and the 2000s, it was largely Mexicans coming over, mostly young men, looking for work opportunities in the United States, trying to evade capture by the Border Patrol. The majority coming now are asylum seekers from Central America. That's a different population. They show up, they're turning themselves in. They have a right under our laws to do that. They're not properly called illegal, unauthorized, undocumented, anything else. They're following the laws of the United States. And that's a different population that requires a different response.
Can you provide some numbers? I keep hearing that the number of Mexicans is at an all-time low. The last 10 years has been a decline. Do you have specific numbers on that?
Well, the number of illegal entries, you go back about a decade, and this was sometimes people coming across multiply, but you had about 1.6 million successful illegal entries in the middle of the 2000s. The latest number suggests last year you had about 200,000 successful illegal entries, so a 90% drop. If you're looking at the apprehensions, now a majority of the people the Border Patrol are counting and arresting are not Mexicans. They are people coming from other countries, primarily from Central America. Again, you go back 10, 15 years and 90% of the apprehensions were Mexicans. So there's been a huge change in terms of both of the numbers and of the people who are arriving at the border and what they're seeking when they get there.
Paola, you're in San Diego, but you have knowledge of the entire U.S.-Mexico border. How have the rhetoric under President Trump, how has that impacted business along the border?
Thank you for having us here today. It has been very negative. It's difficult to work across the border to accomplish business deals when relationships are critical. And cross-border relationships, are very delicate right now. When you say, hey, let's enter into this contract, we want to export our products to you, but by the way, that ends our relationship and we're going to build this wall to divide us. It's very difficult.
It's impacted investment?
It has. So for largely the small and medium-sized businesses, it can't take risks without knowing where the policy direction is going to take. And there's so much uncertainty right now. And that is very damaging. The larger companies can take that risks, so they're less impacted. But small and medium-sized businesses are the backbone of our economy, and when there's such great uncertainty and negative sentiment, that it certainly impacts. And we've already seen that. We've already seen a decline in cross-border commerce in the first half of this year.
So instead of focusing on fences or walls, I think you have the first prototype last week, right? What should the policies be focused on from DC to help the border?
Well,
help the Cali Baja region in your case.
Well, for us, and I think this is U.S.-Mexico wide, policies that help to promote efficient movement of people and goods. That makes our borders safer. When you remove there's 99% of the movement across our border is legitimate. You need to move that 99% as efficiently and quickly as possible so you can focus on that 1%. It's like finding the needle in the haystack. You need to make the hay smaller, reduce it in order to find the needle. Or do you pick each and every one out to analyze it? NAFTA is critical too. Free trade is critical to our region and to our country, in fact. And that's these renegotiations that are undergoing right now are critical to our economy. And the success of that we maintain a trilateral agreement is important. And immigration policies, we share a workforce and consumers. And we need, our businesses need legitimate access to that workforce. So improving immigration policies, comprehensive immigration reform is something that's really important in terms of policies.
Sarah, you're the northern border, or near the northern border. Any talk about building the wall with Canada?
No. We're more interested in bridges up there. We specifically won the Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario is responsible for a huge amount of trade between Canada and the United States. And Canada is a trading country. And so when we look at where Canada does business, it's the United States. And where the United States does business, it's Canada. So any talk of tightening up a border on the northern side is really a talk about tightening up trade. And when you start talking about tightening up trade, you start talking about obstacles to business, and you start talking about lost jobs on both sides of the border, which I think is really a lot of the concern with the rhetoric coming out of Washington for the Canadian audience.
How is pre-clearance working in the post 9/11 and even in the post Trump administration?
So the Canadian relationship with the border really was defined by September 11th in a way that I don't think is necessarily true of the southern border. And I'm an American, I live in Canada, I've lived in Mexico as well in border communities, and it is a very different relationship that the Canadians have with their border with the United States and the southern border. And it's kind of this notion of, there's this idea of kind of an asterisk Canada, that the United States has policies that go for the rest of the world, but then Canada gets an asterisk and gets its own kind of, its own place in US policy. And so they've really embraced that. And post 9/11, the government of Canada came to the government of the United States and said, we know you want to tighten up security. We felt this. We were the recipient of many Americans, as everybody probably now knows, with the Broadway play Come From Away. Gander, Newfoundland took in literally thousands of people in a town of thousands. And so they had a relationship starting there that eventually evolved into this beyond the border relationship, which is a Canada-US agreement, started in 2011 and led to the pre-clearance agreement, which was signed in 2015. So when you fly into the United States from Ottawa, from Toronto, from Montreal, from Calgary, from Vancouver, you actually clear United States Customs and you're welcomed home while you're still in Canada. And so when I flew down here yesterday, I went through pre-clearance in Ottawa, and the CBP officer says to me, and I can probably throw a rock and hit my car in the garage. He says to me, welcome home. So it's a surreal feeling, but it is how it's defined in Canada. And as we look at greater pre-clearance opportunities, you see a Canadian feeling that the United States rhetoric and the United States focus on security and keeping out certain elements has preempted kind of this asterisk Canada normalized relationship.
Three countries are undergoing renegotiations with NAFTA. When it comes to labor mobility, where can Canada and Mexico work together?
Well, what's interesting with labor mobility is it's Chapter 16 of NAFTA is a discussion of all the different categories of business professionals that can work in the three countries from those three countries. And Canada and Mexico have long wanted to see the list of professions that are on this list in Chapter 16 expanded, because this list was developed in the early 1990s and late 1980s when the negotiations were beginning. So there are jobs that I don't think any of us had even conceived of back in, and we couldn't have ever thought of back in 1990, that are now really integral to the success of the economy in all three countries. And the ability of professionals, and especially, I'll take a good American company, for example, is Microsoft, has a large campus in Redmond, Washington, has another large campus in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it would love to be able to have people cross back and forth to work at the two facilities legally who are American or Canadian. And currently, there's not a provision within NAFTA that facilitates that. So the NAFTA visa requirement requires you to fit into one of these categories, and those categories are outdated. So when Canada brought a list of labor mobility codes to the NAFTA table, the pushback from the American negotiation team was pretty firm. And there is a feeling in the United States government that NAFTA was a one-off. We discussed basically immigration, work permits, work visas in a trade agreement for the first time ever, and we've never done it again as Americans. And there's a sense now with the Canadian and within the Canadian and the Mexican business communities that maybe the United States is going to rethink all of this, and how disastrous would that be for the thousands of workers of Canadian citizenship and of Mexican citizenship that are working in the United States, and the Americans that are working in Canada and Mexico. That sense of interconnectivity will be lost without the Chapter 16 labor mobility codes, and the expansion of those are really critical.
Ambassador Sarukan, you've been at this for a while. You were at the embassy, no, when the negotiations started with NAFTA back in '93.
Not as an ambassador, though.
Not as an ambassador. When you look back and you look at the integration that's taken place, what does a wall mean to you personally? What does a wall mean for Mexicans in general?
Good morning, and it's a privilege and honor to be on this, I think, critically important panel to set the conversation rolling today. Given that I'm a recovering diplomat, I can now say stuff that I couldn't say when I was ambassador from '07 to '13. So as an ambassador, I would have said, I'm not going to give the US lessons on how to deal or not deal with its national security. But you have to start when talking about the wall, that the problem with this is that the US, the current administration, is using a first century BC strategy to confront 21st century challenges. You just have to look at how national security threats to the United States have morphed over the past decade on cybersecurity to understand that regardless of whether you build a 50-foot wall from sea to shining sea, that's not going to improve US security, simply because of how issues like cyber have fundamentally impacted the way the United States thinks about the national security of its homeland and the security of its citizens. But the most important piece here is that there are a few issues that have grated Mexican public opinion so much as the narrative and the flatulence that we saw in the 2016 campaign over the border wall. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why, and Pew just came out with an update of its global perceptions and attitudes around the world. You don't have to be a genius to figure out why the country where the favorability perceptions of the United States has fallen the most is Mexico. It has flatlined. And this is a big problem, because if we were Croatian, we lived on the other side of the ocean, you know, so what if, I wouldn't like it because I've dedicated my whole career to the relationship with the United States, but it's probably less relevant if you're the Croatian prime minister. But these are two countries where you can't press Control-Alt-Delete. We're not going to go anywhere anytime soon. These are two countries that have become interconnected. You just go to the border region. You live there, and the chief's there. There's a border region on both sides of our common border, which has completely changed the nature of how our two countries look like. There's almost a third country on either side of our common border in terms of economic interdependence, social connectivity, cultural expressions. So the issue is how do we reclaim, beyond what the United States decides to do or does not do on its border to enhance security? And all of us, or a lot of us in this room, and especially up here, know that the issue of security on the border doesn't even have to do with what happens between ports of entry. The issues of relevant border security are through the ports of entry. That's where guns going in one direction, or drugs and undocumented, either smuggled or trafficked individuals are coming across. So it's not it's not in the wilderness of the Arizona-Texas desert. It's through those 42 points of entry across our border. So we're really serious about enhancing border security. Let's do what Mexico and the United States have been doing since 9/11, which was to devise a series of protocols to ensure that we were sharing intelligence, that we're working together on those ports of entry, that we're using technology that's already there that can enhance our ability to gain greater operational control of the border. And let's leave this Teflon-coated, fact-free vision of what happens or does not happen on the border to other individuals who know nothing about what's going on there. But the whole issue about the border and Trump's wall on the border has really poisoned the well of two countries that are uniquely important to each other's well-being, security, and prosperity. There's no country, regardless of the geopolitical hotspots that the United States faces today, whether it's with North Korea or in Afghanistan, the Middle East, or the Persian Gulf, there's no relationship on the face of the earth that on a daily basis touches the lives of so many Americans like the relationship with Mexico.
How are these two communities culturally, economically integrated? And is that really at stake? I'm asking you, Paula.
Oh, okay.
I mean, can you undo the integration that's been going on for nearly 30 years now?
No, and in fact, it's something that is understood along the border region, regardless of political party. It's a full integration, and what we often say is when one side of the border catches a cold, the other side catches a cold as well. We're completely connected. Like,
can you undo that?
You cannot. No, we're not neighbors. We're family. In our not just our border region, but others as well. The Cholos soccer team of Tijuana is our soccer team, and we cross the border to go to those games, and they used to cross the border to go to Charger games, but now they go to Padre games. Same in El Paso with the Chihuahuas. The Chihuahuas team is named after Chihuahua, the bordering state in Mexico. We share environment. We share water source, the air. You know, it's something that you can't divide the air, or you can't suddenly divide the environmental impacts. We're completely connected. We have a fluid workforce that crosses the border in both directions on a daily basis. We have students that cross the border to go attend schools on both sides. Our staff, we have a staff member that crosses the border every day, lives in Tijuana. It's something that you can't divide, not with a physical barrier or a symbolic one either. We're too deeply connected.
Chief Acevedo, are communities and border states less safe and more susceptible to crime because of their proximity to the border?
No, again, you know, when I talk to all my partners that work on the border, police chiefs, they're going to tell you that what she just talked about, that it's relatively safe. There's actually a meshing of the communities on both sides of the border. It's just one big community. And quite frankly, there's a lot of anger because what this wall is going to do is tear down centuries of interdependence and relationships between both sides, right? So it's going to tear down the fabric that was actually melded together between both sides of the border, and it's going to undo, you know, 200 years of really good outcomes. So for me, again, what we need to do in this country, and I'm going to just say it out, I don't know if it's part of the question, I'm going to throw it out, we need comprehensive immigration reform. We need to get it done. We need to stop worrying about, you know, unfortunately, we need to stop worrying about primary politics because we've divided this country, every congressional district, every state representative district, into safe districts. So what do both sides of the aisle care about? They don't care about good policy. They care about good, not even politics, it's good primary politics.
Survival.
Right, because the general elections don't matter anymore. And so we need to make a decision. Are we interested in getting reelected, or are we interested in getting good policy done? We've got to, the border's been secure. It's been secure for a long time. We've got to bring people out of the shadows. And for the people on the left, okay, I am an immigrant. I've been working with immigrant communities my entire professional career. Most of them don't care about getting the right to vote. All they care about, listen to me, all they care about is getting a driver's license, being able to go to work, being able to go take their kids to school. It is a give and take, and it makes me angry when both extremes are just that extreme, worry more about their own positions and their own priorities than what's important for our country and most importantly, what's important for 11 to 15 million people. Let's all give and take, and let's get these people out of the shadows once and for all.
I know you're in law enforcement, but you had Hurricane Harvey. I'm wondering, how concerned are you about labor shortages? I mean, who's going to rebuild Houston?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that because we know when I'm reading in the, you know, I'm a Texan by choice, an American by choice, right? Because I've immigrated twice now, right? I've immigrated from Cuba to California, California to Texas. And I saw Kevin McCarthy the other day. You all know Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican leader in the House. And then I saw somebody in Texas, I won't use his name. But I said, hey, so I see McCarthy during Hurricane Harvey. I go, hey, have you explained to the Texans that this SB4 and all this silliness is completely going to destroy them politically because they're playing political checkers? You know, here's the elephant in the room. Here's the elephant in the room. This is all about white America not having babies, and they're seeing that we are, okay? They're afraid. Hey, the ship has sailed. You can't change it. The ship has sailed. You cannot change it. And when I told this state guy who was pushing SB4, I looked at him and I said, hey, so-and-so, what the hell are you going to do now when we have tens of thousands of homes that have been underwater and businesses and schools? Who's going to rebuild this stuff? That's right. Who's going to rebuild it? When I see in California that crops are absolutely rotting, okay, who's paying for that? Americans that don't want immigration. Guess who's paying for that? You are. You're paying for the failure of politicians to enact policies that are in the best interest of all Americans. We're all paying it from an economic standpoint, a public safety standpoint, and a national security standpoint. When we bring people out of the shadows, it's a win on all fronts, and you can't argue against it.
Edward, do we risk conflating issues related to national security, trade, and enforcing immigration laws when we talk about border security?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, no question. And I think a lot of the damage that's been done over the past couple of decades is the post-9/11 conflation of national security with issues of immigration control, which really, by and large, have nothing to do with each other. I want to make one point that responds to this question, but also reinforces what Ambassador Sarkhan said about the ports of entry. So in all this focus on building barriers between the ports of entry, one of the really quite amazing findings in this research I was part of, and I want to give proper credit. The lead authors were John Whitley of the Institute of Defense Analysis and Brian Roberts, who worked with him. Brian has got a piece out in the fall issue of the Cato Journal that goes through a lot of this research. The department has not made it fully public yet, but some of it is leaked out there. But one of the things that the research discovered was that it's actually somewhat easier to get smuggled illegally through the ports of entry than it is between the ports. It's more expensive, right? You pay smugglers more, but the success rate is higher through the ports of entry. And if what you're really concerned about is national security, and post 9/11, what that means is someone who comes into the United States, or some number of people coming to the United States with the intention of carrying out a terrorist attack. I'm a lot more worried about the security of the ports of entry with respect to that. I mean, remember, all 19 of the 9/11 hijackers came legally to the United States on legal visas. It was loopholes in the legal system. I'm far more concerned about the ports of entry than I am between the ports. I mean, the other thing that is just not fully recognized at all is how effective the cooperation among the United States, Mexico, and Canada has been with respect to national security. I mean, I think I can talk about this now. You didn't used to be able to, but very quickly after 9/11, the Mexican government started sharing in real time all of its passenger information. So everybody coming from overseas into Mexico, sharing it with US officials so that the Americans could vet those individuals against databases of known and suspected terrorists. The purpose being to keep those individuals out of North America. Same kind of cooperation going on between the US and Canada. That has been tremendously effective. It is not coincidental, A, that there have been so few terror attacks in the United States since 9/11, and B, that the perpetrators have all been people who were here in the United States for some significant period of time already. Not like the hijackers, people coming in temporarily. So the security story is one of tremendous success through cooperation, and yet the immigration story has become, oh my gosh, we can't control it, and therefore we, the United States, need to act unilaterally in stupid ways like building a wall. That just completely misunderstands everything we've learned from the post-9/11 years.
Is there a silver lining, Ambassador? You talk about increased cooperation over the last 3 decades, and at the same time, same breath, you talk about building walls. I mean, where is the silver lining? And is cooperation also at stake as you renegotiate NAFTA?
I don't think there's a silver lining, quite unfortunately. I think this president has put the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States in a tailspin. Depending on how the NAFTA negotiations go, which does not seem to be peachy and rosy at the moment, it could also scupper some of the protocols that we have developed in North America with our Canadian colleagues since 9/11, which Ted was just referring to. There's a real risk that the Mexican government, if this policy of ambush and the Sinatra doctrine of my way or the highway continues to be the leitmotif of this administration, may start saying, look, we're not going to collaborate on what we're already doing to deter Central American migration, transmigration through Mexico on its way to the United States. A process that, by the way, is the son and grandson of refugees in Mexico, is violating asylum and refugee hearings for some of these Central American migrants coming through Mexico. The Mexican government could say, we're not going to continue to do that because it's had very high, elevated domestic political costs. And, you know, if this town is all about domestic politics, I don't need to remind anyone on this panel that Mexico is heading into a presidential election on July the 1st of next year. So domestic politics is also going to start coloring a lot of the decisions, whether it's related to what we agree to or not on NAFTA, or whether we decide to pull the plug on a series of issues that it took us 20 years to build, that created a sense of strategic traction in the US-Mexico bilateral relationship, and which, despite what was said on the campaign trail, has elevated the US-Mexico security relationship to levels that this relationship had never seen in the past.
What does a more nationalistic Mexico, what may a more nationalistic Mexico mean for the United States?
Look, I'm a rarity as a career Mexican diplomat because most foreign services like generalists, they don't like specialists. And I did all my career related to the US and to US foreign policy. So I spent my 22 years in government service engaging with the United States. And so I feel very strongly, and this may sound weird coming from a Mexican diplomat, but I do think the United States is an indispensable partner and nation in the hemisphere, and there's no relationship more important for Mexico than the relationship with the United States. But I think a lot of it is in how we continue to underscore to Mexicans and Americans alike on both sides of the border that these are two countries that have a very, very simple question in front of them. Do we continue to be partners to success, or do we become accomplices to failure? And one of the things that I've said on and off every single day since the 2016 presidential campaign started is Mexico and the United States have done many great things together, can continue to do a great many things together, but the one thing that Mexico and the United States are not going to be doing together is building Trump's wall.
You're not going to pay for it?
We're not going to pay
Oh,
for it.
Lord, okay. That's what I thought.
Sarah, Canada in recent months has become the new beacon of hope, the new place for immigrants. You've seen a recent wave of illegal crossings. Can talk about the next steps in cooperation?
Sure. Well, and this is kind of twofold, because when Canadians talk about border security, they like to talk about perimeter security. And Canadians prefer to think of border security as something that the Canadians do with Americans, and it's a continental perspective, that it's not about what's happening at the northern border, it's what's happening at the entry points into Canada from other places outside of the continent. And so what's been interesting to watch is, since the election, and especially since inauguration in January, there have been streams of essentially illegal immigrants coming from the United States into Canada. And what was alarming about this initially is that there was a group, it was essentially one community moving out of the United States and trying to move into Manitoba, which is north of North Dakota. So in February, on foot. And so that was alarming to the Canadians for a number of reasons, mostly because they're worried about the safety of these individuals. And then as we saw the winter and move into spring, we saw a movement in Quebec border, and then now it's on the Ontario border. So at the moment, and I honestly don't have a good sense of how much coverage this is getting in the United States, but it's on the nightly news in Canada, you have busloads of people who are either illegally in the United States and have been illegally in the United States for a while, who came in legally perhaps and their visas have lapsed, who came in. There was literally thousands of Haitians that were relocated to the United States after the earthquake and have been in this special status ever since, that now see that status ending, and so they showed up at the northern door, and because of the Safe Third Country Agreement, if they go to a port of entry, they are refused entry, and they can't claim asylum. However, if they cross the border in between, they are arrested by the RCMP, and then they can be subjected to normal asylum claims. And that's what they're choosing to do. And so you have this really strange sight right now on the New York-Ontario border of these tent cities on the Canadian side, where they've created RCMP locations to accept these illegal immigrants. And you have these RCMP officers in Kevlar and in their full, pseudo-military police uniforms, who very kindly say to these people as they get out of their taxi cabs, do you understand that if you cross here, you will be placed under arrest, that this is not a crossing and that it is illegal for you to cross the border here. You'll be placed under arrest of the RCMP. And you have refugees and people who are here illegally in the United States who show up at the border and say, yes, please, just let us cross. And they cross and they go through, and at one point this summer, they were living in the Montreal Expo Biodome, just essentially a conference center much like this in cots, and because that's what Quebec did. And so Canada sees a silver lining in this, and that they may be opening their doors, and this may be a struggle at the moment, but at the end of the day, Canada sees an opportunity for itself, because as a bunch of white people, they're not having a whole lot of babies. And so to
The point.
the police chief's point, they need immigration, and they have acknowledged for the last few governments that they need immigration in order to maintain economic competitiveness. And so they're opening their doors, and they continue to open their doors, not just
Smart.
to these, but to refugees from around the world. And so they see this as an opportunity to grow their own economy, which is the size of California's, right? So it's not a large economy.
So you're not seeing a backlash at the moment?
Well, you are seeing certain groups. I think, especially within Quebec, you have nationalist type overtones there, where you have groups that have presented themselves as being anti-immigrant. But I would say that the voices in Canada are louder for pro-immigration. They're louder for keeping the doors open and bringing in people, resettling. Canada's a country where the people of Canada came together to figure out how to resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees when their prime minister said, we're going to open the doors and let them in. The Canadian people said, okay, how are we going to figure out how we pay for this? And churches and schools and community groups figured out how they were going to pay for these people, bring them in, integrate them into the Canadian community, teach them hockey, everything, right? So that's what they've done.
Alfredo, can I just very quickly, but I think at the core of this is that Canada has understood something that this country has sadly forgotten, which is that throughout history, nations have succeeded thanks to human connections. And this is what Canada understands today, and this is what this forum here is about today too.
Edward, as we look to the future, define what the new workforce will look like.
That is a big question, actually. Can I just make one comment on the Canada stuff? Because I'm second to none in my admiration for Canadian immigration policy. But I do think in any country there needs to be a level of control in order to maintain public confidence in the immigration system. Yes. I mean, you saw that in Germany with the huge refugee flows coming from Syria and the political problems that has caused. So I do worry if the numbers get very large, that the perception of the situation being out of control is one that actually could do some damage in Canadian politics. So I don't think the receptivity is unlimited. I think there has to be a sense by the public, and this was the problem in the United States, right? We let the situation get out of control in the 1990s and 2000s, and that's when publics lose confidence. I'm a believer in high levels of immigration, but I think they need to be managed carefully. So.
And they did. They have returned about half the number of asylum applicants that have crossed through in between these ports of entry have been basically ordered removed because they don't meet the qualifications for asylum in Canada. So there is a sense of there is a rule of law. It's just a little bit broader.
So just quickly on the workforce and my current project now.
We have I think 2 minutes before the Q&A, so please start writing your questions, and we'll go to that.
Good, and I will answer quickly. My current project actually is on the future of the U.S. workforce. I'm working with the former Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker and John Engler, who was the governor of Michigan. And really, I mean, I think there are sort of three pillars to it. One, we need to educate the heck out of everybody here in this country. That our educational levels have been flat for far too long. The best jobs of the future demand higher levels of education. I'm not just talking four-year college. I'm talking, serious community college training. So I think that's answer number one. I think answer number two is you need a lot of flexibility, and I think immigration fits in very well with that. I think the stuff that Sarah was talking about in terms of labor mobility, I think is critical for the competitive success of our companies. And so I think, the efforts of the Trump administration to shut down higher skilled immigration worry me tremendously. And then I think third, if you look at the labor projections, there are going to be big demands for essentially personal service jobs of one sort or another, home health care aides and nursing and all of that. And if you look at who's doing that work here in this country, a lot of that is being done by immigrants. And there were other things mentioned here in terms of agriculture and construction, but I mean, the immigrant labor force is a hugely important part of the U.S. labor force. So we've got to figure out this problem. This is not just about the immigrants. This is about the future of our economy.
I mean, I was taking the question from Chief Acevedo's point that whites are having less babies, so where does the new workforce come from?
Well, I mean, there's no question. There's no question there is a demographic challenge. I mean, realistically, if you're looking at the question of who's going to pay for me when I retire, we're not going to bring in enough immigrants to solve that. I mean, the whole world has a demographic challenge. The Chinese have it, the Europeans have it. But countries that are open to immigration are going to handle that better than countries that are not. We know that. And if the U.S. turns in the other direction, then there, legislation like the RAISE Act that's being floated, which would take us back, to where we were in the 1920s and 30s. I think we know where that story ends, and it's in a very bad place.
We go to questions. Okay, so where are the questions?
Yeah, if I can add to that too, it's really interesting how the proposals that are coming out of the administration don't mesh. The proposed budget, for example, the president presented requires an increase of GDP, our gross domestic product. And that's, that's calculated based on how much we produce, right? In order to achieve the economic growth that is required for that budget, we need to, our immigrant population needs to double the existing population that we have in our country. And the policies that are being proposed are certainly not going to accomplish that. Even if we weren't to change any policies, we still need to make modifications in the other direction to grow our immigrant population, to grow our economy. There's a study, a really interesting study, that showed that the alternative to that, how else can you achieve that economic growth if we move to a 6-day work week? I'm not sure here how many people would support working 6 days a week. If you think immigration policies don't impact you, there's so many repercussions, and certainly what will be expected of our current workforce and our economy that's existing.
I'm just being told that if you have a question, please raise your hand so they can pick it up.
But part of the problem is that the immigration policy being articulated by the administration in the White House is like someone who one day decides to shoot the hostage, the next day decides to release the hostage, and then the day after decides to keep the hostage. There's a contradiction in terms of, even on DACA and Dreamers. Yesterday, the DHS had to come out and roll back and walk back what a high-level DHS official had just said on Capitol Hill. So part of the problem is that you've got an administration that is being buffeted and pressured and controlled by different groups within the White House, outside the White House, and you don't have a coherent line as to what the policy needs to look like.
I'm going to throw this question out. As a border resident, I've always been curious. How do you close the divide between thriving communities like the border, whether it's Laredo, whether it's McAllen, El Paso, the San Diego region? How do you close that divide with cities in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio? How do you?
I have the answer to that.
Por
favor. So it's not just about Mexico, right? I think is your answer. Because when you look at the Great Lakes region, which is a region that is 8 states and 2 provinces, if you just do the math on the economy that's generated in that area, you're talking about the 3rd largest economy in the world after the United States and China. So when you're talking to northern tier cities, when you're talking to Detroit, when you're talking to Chicago, when you're talking to Cincinnati, when you talk about border policy and immigration policy, although they're seeing it through a slightly different lens because they're coming from the north, they are in agreement that you have to have you have to have an immigration policy that makes sense, and you have to have a security policy that makes sense. And the two things may be complementary, but they're very, very rarely, as you said earlier, the same thing.
I am told that while I get the questions, there's an ongoing polling questions. I think you can see it on the board. Please pick the question here. No one crosses the border who is an unauthorized, dangerous, illicit activity is contained. Terrorists and other national security threats are prevented. Good coming and going across the border are secure, or none of the above. The instructions are on your table. Please take the poll.
But see, can I take a dig at that?
Sure.
The way it's phrased, again, puts the onus on security as if it was just an issue on the Mexican-US border or the Canadian-US border. This is about all ports of entry, maritime and land, and how the US understands the complex dynamic that occurs between all those points. It's not just about things coming across a border, it's things coming through ports of entry, whether it's the port of LA or Laredo, Nuevo Laredo.
Well, and even to emphasize that more, I mean, one of the things that was understood immediately after 9/11 was that border challenges need to be confronted a long way from the border. I mean, the whole idea of perimeter security, pushing the border out. I mean, we cooperate with the big ports around the world, Rotterdam and Hong Kong and Singapore and other places, to inspect cargo before it ever gets on the ship coming to the United States. These are all based on cooperative relationships.
Yep.
If we blow those things up and try to do it all at the frontiers, we're going to be far less secure than we have been for the last
And what's
couple of
evident is if this debate over what is border security fails, all our attempts to get common sense immigration policies and immigration reform on the table are going to fail because of how Trump turned immigration into the third rail of one of the two political parties in the United States.
Couple of quick questions. We're down to the last minute or two. This is from the audience. Would not an increased focus on border security at the ports further slow down the movement of goods and people? How can it be done better and move more efficiently? That's one question. Second question, this is for Edward. Can you shed light on the effect that immigrants have on the competitiveness of American businesses and the overall effect that it has on our economy? And then my personal question to Chief Acevedo is, are you planning to meet with the Texas delegation while you're here?
Oh, they hear from me all the time. When they see me coming, they go the other way. They're tired of hearing from me. But I've met with them. I just met with them during Hurricane Harvey with Senator Cornyn, talked to Senator Cruz, talked to the Republican leader. I've talked to and met with the speaker not too long ago. And you know what? I'm a glass half full guy. I think because the rhetoric has been so ugly that it's really food for the base, that because of the ugly rhetoric, that if any administration might be able to get something done, might be this one. So I'm hopeful that because of their rhetoric, they've got some street creds, and maybe they'll get it done. But maybe I'm being naive. We'll see. Time will tell.
They just passed the $10 billion measure yesterday, led by the Texas Michael McCall. But that's another issue. Edward, you want to answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, the evidence on this is overwhelming. Immigrants have been a huge part of American success, particularly in terms of innovation. I mean, modern economies rise or fall based on how innovative their leading companies are. It's not a coincidence that we've got, Intel and Google and Facebook and Microsoft. The world's most innovative companies are here in the United States, and a big reason to that has been our attractiveness to ambitious and highly educated immigrants. I mean, our university system is a big part of that. They come to our universities and they stay. We don't have time to go through it, but there are lots of things this administration is doing that will make life harder and harder and harder for those immigrants. And they aren't going to keep coming. And the economic damage is going to last for generations.
And meanwhile, Canada is recruiting these international students at
Happy
American
Canada,
universities.
We're down to 2 minutes. Any last points you want to make, Ambassador?
On the question of how do you ensure that was it technology? How you ensure that whatever's coming across the border is safe? You can chew gum and whistle at the same time. And in fact, most of what we've been doing since 9/11 has been predicated on being able to enhance common security and common prosperity. That is, how do you facilitate secure flows of goods and people across the border? And we've done that on the Canadian-US border. We've done that on the Mexican-US border with issues like pre-clearance, which was being described to you in terms of how you fly back and forth from Canadian airports to the United States. It's being done in terms of pre-inspection, which is when you load a container full of avocados in Mexico. There are CBP officials in Mexico that inspect that container, certify that it has nothing else than avocados, and when that truck reaches the border, it goes through specific lanes where the truck just goes through a gamma ray system which inspects the truck in real time. You can pinpoint to a pin what's in the truck, and it goes straight through. So you're creating mechanisms that put the resources, the manpower, and the intelligence on focusing on what has not been predetermined as safe, secure, or pre-inspected.
Hey, Paola, this question is for you, and I think you already sort of addressed it, and maybe you want to emphasize it a little more. But would an increased focus on border security at the ports further slow down the movement of goods and people? How can it be done better and move more efficiently?
Yeah, certainly. And this goes back to the question of how do you define a secure border? Because our belief is it is secure. already. And so the net migration being 0 now, our greatest challenges are the negative rhetoric and the continuous discussion or belief, the perception that our border is not secure.
Or getting the message out through the media when we are fake news.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, most of the decisions that are being made are thousands of miles away from the border by people that have never been to the border and don't know what it actually is. They don't see it as, they don't know that it's a thriving economic engine and a destination, and not a place that we want to avoid. It's not a war zone. It's not the most dangerous place in America. I've seen media reports that say that, and what we're doing is trying to bring people. We were here in DC last week, and we met with several members of Congress from outside of our region, and also different secretaries, and we asked them, please come to the border. We want to show you what's happening here, and that's really important. Of course, we can't, it's not as effective to bring one person at a time, but if we can change the perception, that's a big part of the discussion. And I'm gonna I'll close with saying this. I agree with the chief here. I'm very optimistic that this is the time to get things done. I don't care about the political party that gets the credit for it. The time is now. And I think we can, the stars are all aligned to make this happen. We've been working on comprehensive immigration reform for 10 years. And a lot of it was because they did not want to give credit to certain political party. Who cares who gets it done? We're supportive of this administration if they're going to, push for some of this immigration policies, and I think that it can get done.
On that hopeful note, thank you very much.